The speaking part of the IELTS test is broken down into 3 sections. The first part is where the examiner, the interlocutor, asks questions of the candidate that are about their general likes and dislikes, what you prefer doing with your friends, and nothing too strenuous, and the candidate is expected to give reasonably short answers in not a huge amount of detail. It moves on to part 2, which is where the candidate is given a topic. This is known as the long turn. The candidate talks about this for 2 minutes, and the topics that you get in this are generally things that relate a book that you've read. It could be you tell a story about something that happened to you, a place you'd like to visit. It's still quite personal in nature, but it does ask the candidate to expand their language output slightly. At the end of that 2 minutes, the interlocutor asks a follow-up question and the candidate gives a short answer. The topic of part 2 is then taken on to part 3, so it follows on logically, and part 3 basically opens it up, and the questions that the candidate get are more abstract and ask them to consider things maybe a bit more critical thinking in terms of their answer, cause and effect, and to place a question in a context of society or in the world or in the environment. And they're more linguistically challenging because they ask the candidate to do a bit more speculation. And so rather than descriptive language or simple language that you might be capable of getting away with at part 1, this is more about you use things like modality and hypothetical language. And so it does become more complex as it goes on. A lot depends on the level of the student, because at a lower level, you haven't got the ability to speak fluently and to vocalise your thought processes that you have at a higher level. At a lower level, you sort of have to plan what you're going to say before you say it a lot more. And so, yes, it can be helpful to teach students some phrases that help them to buy time. Don't necessarily overdo it, because what you don't want is a student who goes into an exam and every question that they get from the interlocutor, they're saying, well, that's a very good question. I've never thought of that before. Or, let me think. There's a way it needs to be natural. So there are some compensation strategies that you can use. But make students aware that if it sounds too memorised and practiced, then they can't really expect a really high score. But at a lower level, you give them the help that you can. There's quite a lot in mindset at the lower end of the scale, where you get phrases that help you buy time to construct your answer. There are a lot of these tips that say, okay, if you're going to do part 3, you might not be able to develop your answer in the same way that a high level student could, but you can still do it to a certain extent and to the best of your ability. But in terms of part 3, the questions can be quite challenging. They can be difficult. One thing that I would try and suggest is try and get your students to sound as natural as possible. One thing that causes problems is if they are focusing constantly on thinking, I need to use the correct grammar, or if they overthink their choice of language and what words they're going to use, then they kind of get stuck. One of the categories in the speaking test that the examiners are assessing is fluency and coherence. Now, speaking fluently doesn't necessarily mean that you are speaking in full and complete sentences from start to finish that are perfectly constructed and you don't pause for breath as I'm doing now, because that's not a natural way of speaking. People don't do that. Fluency is about being able to produce a language in a naturalistic way. So try and get your students to do that as much as it's possible for them to do. They might not be producing completely correct language, but at least they are producing something in a fluid way. Another important tip in terms of sounding natural that I try and make sure that my students have is that in various countries in the world that have different language systems to English, when you're thinking about what you're going to say, the sound can be quite elongated. So you may find in certain cultures that when you're trying to say something, the are longer. They're more punctuated in English. We don't do the long ers. And so what I often teach my students is try and cut those down, because then you'll sound more natural. And in English, we tend to say or And it's just these little things that add up to you being able to tell the student, don't just get focused, don't get too preoccupied on using the perfect grammar, because you've got to try and sound natural as well, and you've got to be as natural sounding as you possibly can. And that's difficult for lower levels in part 3, but it's so important if you are aiming for a higher score. The part 3 questions that you get, it doesn't matter too much if you jump back and forward on what you're saying, as long as you're doing it in a way that people might do naturally in conversation. Because Nobody speaks in a completely linear fashion. Nobody says, here's my point, and I'm going to get from point A to point B just completely logically. People jump about. So at higher levels, you can teach your students that it's okay to do that, and it's okay to say, do you know what, something I didn't mention before, or relating it back to what I said earlier on, and that actually helps their score in the end, because it shows the examiner that they are using the language to keep the flow of conversation, but to refer back to what they've already said. Or in part two, what I said in part two about such and such, and relate it to part three. That's actually a very, very interesting quirk of the way that language is produced. We don't just speak in a linear fashion. We don't just go from A to B. We jump about everywhere. And if you can get students to understand that, I've found from experience that they tend to relax a little bit more when they know they haven't got to create these perfectly structured sentences and this perfectly structured answer. As long as you're going from point A to point B, digressions are okay. And then as you go and you add an extra bit of information, or you refer back to what you've just said, a phrase like, anyway, as I was saying, and then you come back to where you are. So in terms of teaching, it's being aware of the way that natural spoken language works. Spoken grammar, spoken language, is totally different from written grammar and written language. And it's okay for students not to produce something that's perfect, because even the most eloquent native speaker doesn't do that all the time. It's really, really unlikely that in the exam that the student is going to have absolutely nothing to say about a topic they're given or a question they're given. But in the Mindset series, what we've tried to do is to give questions that support that idea that you're not necessarily going to come into contact with a question that you don't know the answer to, that you have nothing to say on. But if you do, there are ways around it. There are strategies around it. You have to know that if it's something that you don't know particularly much about, or you can't find a lot to talk about, well, how do you compensate for that? And if you go through the series, you'll see that there's a lot of linguistic, a lot of lexical support for that, building that process of, maybe I don't necessarily know everything about this topic, but it doesn't really matter. I can tell you what I do know. And that, again, is the important thing, because it's freeing the students from this box that they find themselves in. I have to answer this question in exactly that way. Yeah, there's an approach for each question, but be a bit more free with your students and say there's no rigid one way of doing this. There are lots of different approaches to the questions that are put out through the Mindset series. There isn't just one thing that suits everybody. The main point is that if you have got an accent, then that's okay. It doesn't matter if you're from a different nationality. You don't have to try and overcompensate and try and sound like a particular person that you've seen on the telly or you've heard on the radio, or what your idea of a perfect pronunciation is. The main thing is that when you get in the exam room, that you are intelligible, that the examiner can understand what you're saying. And so a teacher needs to be aware of their individual students, and maybe there's certain areas of pronunciation that student has a problem with. That student might not have. They might have something different. As long as the overall intelligibility is good, you can work on fine-tuning. As long as they are putting the stress and the prominence in the right places in words and sentences. English is very much about the stress. Work on chunking, work on groups of words together and putting the stress in the right place, rather than individual sound formation. It's about how the examiner can understand you. It's not about how well you can approximate a particular sound according to what you think it is or what you've heard it to be.